Thank you so much, Alan and Beth. Um, so I have a few questions for Alan, but I'll save them till the Q&A. So Paul, um, tell us a little bit about how you got the idea for Putin's Exiles and how you did the reporting.
Right. So initially, my thought about this book, and this was before the all-out invasion of Ukraine by Putin 2 years ago, was to go inside of Russia and maybe go to some places that journalists and people don't usually go to, and just try to maybe undermine or at least question some of the things that everyone thinks they know about Russia, to kind of approach it from that perspective. But the foreign ministry did not cooperate with my project, so they never actually approved my visa. I began to think, and now the war has happened. So what can I do with this? And so if I can't talk to Russians inside of Russia, why don't I talk to them outside of Russia? Because about 1 million of them had fled after the war. And it seemed to me very interesting that a kind of age-old Russian pattern was repeating itself of exile, which has always been sort of the flip side of repression. So you can go back to the 19th century, even earlier, and there have always been these exiles, many of whom have been politically charged and organized with an agenda for change inside of Russia, but, you know, brought about from outside of Russia. That whole dynamic struck me as interesting. So that was the genesis of the project.
And what countries did you go to primarily to do your reporting?
So I did the field research in Armenia and Georgia. In Armenia, I was in Yerevan, the capital of that country, and in Georgia, I was in both Tbilisi mainly, but also I went to Batumi, which is in the westernmost part on the shores of the Black Sea. I also did quite a bit of interviewing on Zoom, with exiles from all over the place, Munich and Paris, London, Washington, D.C., Cyprus. I mean, they are truly this kind of global diaspora. So not being able to go everywhere, on foot, I did quite a bit of that as well.
Hmm. Well, uh, your chapters and your book, you describe several categories of the exiles, and some of them were Navalny followers, some were
Hmm.
dissident priests, some were military types, and some, as we know, were journalists. So, could you start with the journalists? Um, how are they conducting what you call the information resistance, and is their coverage having any impact inside Russia?
Right. So in Putin's Russia, and remember he's been in power now for about 25 years, it just became increasingly difficult for anyone to do truly independent journalism. Not impossible, but particularly once the war started, it literally became a crime just to call it a war. It had to be called a special military operation. So the situation was really just untenable. In my chapter on the information resistance, I focused on a independent TV station, TV Rain, Dost, which began during the Putin years, not explicitly against Putin, but as attempting to be this independent voice of news and commentary. So they left pretty much just after the war. It just became untenable. They played a few bars of Swan Lake, which has memories because that's what's sort of played whenever there's this interregnum or something big happening in Russia, and the authorities don't want anybody to be, to think about it. So that was a little bit of an ironic homage. Many of them went to Riga, which is the capital of Latvia, where they established their headquarters. Others went to Tbilisi. So what happened was they ran into a lot of problems. I mean, they regarded themselves as sort of umbilically attached to Russia, and their mission was to undertake, news and commentary investigations, and in the Russian language, deliver that media back into Russia, into the Russian homeland, where platforms like YouTube and Telegram, were still open. So this was a feasible thing. the Latvians, I mean, some of the challenges here illustrated in this, the Latvians did not like that the TV Rain people would refer to the Russians and the Russian army even as a we. They objected to that. They thought it should be a they. So there are all these conflicts, and ultimately their license was revoked in Riga, and they had to relocate to Amsterdam, from which they are now operating. I think they're an important voice. I think there are others like Medusa, which is still based in Riga, that are important voices. And the reason I say that is because, first of all, it has to be in the Russian language. I mean, that's, you're going back into Russia, you're trying to influence hearts and minds. One of the journalists for TV Rain in Tbilisi, whom I met with, told me that, I think we've lost my grandfather, but maybe we can save my grandmother. You know, uh, so many people, as you know, Patty, particularly brought up, in the Soviet time, are just habitual. The state media, state-controlled media is kind of what they know, and not just even for news, entertainment, all kinds of things. So they're sort of hooked on it. And TV Rain is, it's something different. It tried to appeal to a younger audience, a little more hip. So it's a real challenge, but they get millions of views. I mean, there is a lot of media that is flowing into Russia, also just at the level of bloggers and people like that. So Navalny's funeral, for example, which is coming up tomorrow in Moscow, March 1st, there's a tremendous amount of information from the Russian exile media about what's happening. Hello to your dog.
Sorry.
It's
So,
okay.
Paul, I was surprised when I read your book, even though I think I knew it subliminally. Why don't the Russians block YouTube?
Right. And we don't know exactly why. The best answer I've had to that, because I know that there are, these Russian exile journalists are preparing for the day that they block YouTube because they have various strategies that they're going to put into effect if that happens. But YouTube is just used by so many ordinary Russians for like their kids watching cartoons, or their, the parents at night watching, movies and songs, all kinds of things. And the political part of it is just one small fraction. So I think that the authorities are still kind of calibrating just how much do they want to crack down. I mean, you can get people kind of restive and unhappy if you start denying them simple things like being able to access YouTube. So it's, I think it's that kind of a calculation. They may also realize that even if they crack down on YouTube, there are other ways. I mean, these exiles, and many of them are also skilled in technology. It's estimated that something like 10% of the IT workers, largely based in Moscow and St. Petersburg, went into exile after the war. So many of Russia's most talented and creative people are now in exile, and they're not so easily thwarted by Kremlin efforts to block channels of information.
I find that very interesting. um, so, moving on, you already talked a little bit about the generational divide, and many of your characters, you describe them having conflicts with their parents.
Yes.
I think most of us can just understand that without any explanation. So, can you move on and tell us how has the killing of Navalny affected those who resist Russia inside and outside of Russia?
Well, I think it's still very early days, but what we're seeing is that some people are feeling demoralized, like, they killed off our guy, the single most charismatic and influential figure, revered by those who really, supported him. He was more than just a political figure. He became a figure of reverence and even kind of a living martyr. But what I'm also picking up is quite a bit of anger, and among people who are really committed to a Putin opposition, I think there's going to be a greater degree of militancy that develops, and I've been talking to people about that. So I expect we'll see things like more targeted assassinations of people in Russia who in some way are associated with the government, whether it's promoting the war or just any number of things. I think that some of that has taken place already, and I think we'll see more of it. There are also some people who have taken up the gun in Ukraine. There's a Free Russia Legion that has been organized, and it's difficult to say exactly how many people it has, but I've been talking to those people as well, including, for example, a volunteer who's on the front lines. And they say, well, yeah, of course, you can't just lay flowers on graves. There's not going to be any change in Russia unless we force the issue. Now, we don't know how far those people will get, but I think that there will be more people who feel that way and attempt to, act on those on that agenda and those impulses. And it's an old story in Russia. I mean, I was reading today about the 19th century. They killed the Tsar in 1881, this group called Narodnaya Volya, the People's Will. They were insurgents. It's just the flip. The more repression that you get in Russia and the more murder that appears to be state directed, I think the more reaction you'll get.